The sun dipped low over Chisum Ranch, Texas, casting long shadows across the dusty Main Street as Josephine Abbott clutched her small carpet bag and stepped off the stagecoach, her face partially hidden beneath the wide brim of her bonnet. The whispers started before her boots even touched the ground. "Ain't that Harold Abbott's wife, the one who ran off and left him? Shameful, absolutely shameful. Never thought she'd have the nerve to show her face in these parts again." It was 1878, and in the small cattle town of Chisum Ranch, a woman leaving her husband was nearly as scandalous as murder. Josephine kept her eyes forward, ignoring the stares that followed her like vultures circling a carcass. She was 23 years old and already felt like she'd lived several lifetimes, each one harder than the last. The boarding house at the end of Main Street was her destination. Mrs. Willoughby had been kind enough to respond to her letter requesting lodging, though Josephine suspected the widow didn't yet realize whose room she had agreed to let. 5 months had passed since she'd fled in the dead of night, but gossip had long memories in small towns. "Josephine Abbott, as I live and breathe." The voice came from the mercantile porch where Edith Parker stood with arms crossed over her ample bosom. "Thought you'd gone off to Dallas for good." Josephine paused, summoning the courage she'd spent months cultivating. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Parker." "Does Harold know you're back?" "I expect he will soon enough." Josephine tightened her grip on her bag. "If you'll excuse me." Behind Edith, several women gathered, their faces a mixture of judgment and barely disguised excitement at this unexpected drama. Josephine could almost hear their thoughts. A wife who abandoned her husband was little better than a harlot. She continued down the street, each step stirring dust that clung to the hem of her faded blue dress. The dress had once been her Sunday best, but now showed wear at the sleeves and waist from months of hard work at her aunt's boarding house in Dallas. "Miss Abbott." The deep voice halted her progress. She turned to find Sheriff Mills approaching, his weathered face unreadable beneath his mustache. "It's still Mrs. Abbott, Sheriff," she corrected quietly. "Course it is." He nodded. "Just wanted to let you know I'll have a word with Harold. Make sure there's no trouble." The implication was clear. Her return would not sit well with her husband. "I appreciate that, but it won't be necessary. I haven't come to cause any disturbance." The sheriff studied her face. "What have you come for then, Mrs. Abbott?" Josephine straightened her spine. "To sell my father's property. It's still in my name, and I intend to settle the matter properly." This was only partly true. Her father's small homestead outside town had been her childhood home, left to her in his will 2 years ago. Harold had wanted to sell it immediately, but she'd resisted, keeping the deed locked away. Now it represented her only chance at true independence. Sheriff Mills touched the brim of his hat. "Fair enough, but this is still a small town. People talk." "Let them," she said with more confidence than she felt. As Sheriff Mills walked away, Josephine continued toward the boarding house. The journey from Dallas had been long, and weariness dragged at her limbs, but determination drove her forward. She'd returned not just for the property, but to reclaim something of herself that she'd lost during 5 years of marriage to Harold Abbott. Mrs. Willoughby answered the door on the third knock, her gray hair pinned tightly at her nape. Recognition dawned in her eyes, followed by uncertainty. "Mrs. Abbott, I hadn't realized it was you who wrote." "It's been some time, Mrs. Willoughby. I understand if you've reconsidered." The older woman hesitated only briefly before stepping aside. "A room is a room, and yours is paid for a week in advance. Come in before the whole town sees you on my porch." Inside, the boarding house smelled of beeswax and fresh bread. Josephine followed Mrs. Willoughby up the narrow staircase to a small room at the back of the house. "It ain't fancy, but it's clean," Mrs. Willoughby said, opening the door. "Supper's at 6 sharp. No gentlemen callers, no noise after 9. Thank you, that's more than fair." Left alone, Josephine sank onto the edge of the narrow bed and finally allowed herself a deep breath. She removed her bonnet, revealing a mass of chestnut hair swept into a simple knot. Her face, once praised for its delicate beauty, had grown thinner, with faint lines at the corners of her eyes that hadn't been there when she left. From her carpet bag, she withdrew a folded document, the deed to her father's property. 10 acres with a small cabin nestled against the creek that ran north of town. It wasn't much, but it was hers. Harold had never managed to get his hands on it, despite his numerous attempts and increasingly violent demands. The bruises had faded months ago, but the memories remained fresh. The night she'd finally fled had come after Harold had discovered she'd hidden away egg money to buy a book of poetry. His rage had been terrible to behold, culminating in a backhand that had split her lip and knocked her against the stove. That night, while he drank himself into a stupor at the saloon, she'd packed her few belongings and caught the midnight stage to Dallas, seeking refuge with her mother's sister. Now she was back, stronger but still afraid. Not just of Harold, but of the judgment that had already begun. In the eyes of Chisum Ranch, she was the villain of this story. A knock at the door startled her from her thoughts. "Mrs. Abbott," Mrs. Willoughby's voice came through the wood. "There's a message been delivered for you. Seems news travels fast." Josephine opened the door and accepted the folded note. She recognized Harold's rough scrawl immediately. "I know you're back. We'll talk tonight. 4 hours." She had 4 hours until her husband would come calling, expecting to reclaim what he considered his property, both the deed and herself. Josephine refolded the note and tucked it into her pocket. She would not be there when Harold arrived. Taking only her deed and what money she had left, she slipped down the back stairs of the boarding house and out into the alley. The sun was lower now, painting the western sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. Most folks would be heading home for supper, leaving the streets relatively empty. She kept to the side streets, making her way toward the land office at the edge of town. If she could file the paperwork to sell before the office closed, she might have a chance to be gone before Harold realized her plan. The land office windows were dark when she arrived, a sign on the door indicating it had closed early. Her heart sank. Tomorrow would be too late. "Looking for Mr. Peterson," a voice called from across the street. Josephine turned to see a tall man in a dusty duster leaning against a hitching post outside the livery stable. His face was partially shadowed by his hat brim, but she could see he was younger than she'd initially thought, perhaps late 20s. "Yes," she admitted, "but it seems I've missed him." The stranger straightened and crossed the street toward her. As he drew closer, she could see his face clearly strong-jawed and sun-browned, with eyes the color of a summer storm. "Frank Turner," he introduced himself, touching his hat brim. "Peterson mentioned he was closing early to check on some property north of town. Should be back tomorrow morning." "I see. Thank you, Mr. Turner." Josephine turned to go, anxiety blooming in her chest. Tomorrow would be too late. "You're in a hurry to see the land agent," he observed. It wasn't a question, but his tone invited explanation. Josephine hesitated. This stranger had no part in the town's gossip mill, at least not yet. "I have business that can't wait until tomorrow." Frank Turner studied her for a moment, then glanced down the street toward the saloon, where men were already gathering for the evening's entertainment. "Would that business have anything to do with Harold Abbott?" he asked quietly. Josephine stiffened. "You know my husband." A slight grimace crossed his face. "We've crossed paths. He's been at the poker tables every night this week, boasting about how his wayward wife is coming back to him with her tail between her legs." Heat rose in Josephine's cheeks, a mixture of embarrassment and anger. "I see his habits haven't changed. I take it that's not why you're back." "No, Mr. Turner, quite the opposite." Frank considered this, then nodded toward the stable. "I was about to ride out to my place. It's not far from Peterson's. I could deliver a message if you'd like." It was a generous offer from a stranger, and Josephine found herself tempted to accept, but caution held her back. "That's kind of you, but Josephine," the shout came from down the street. Harold Abbott was striding toward them, his face flushed with anger and whiskey. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Josephine froze. Harold was a big man, broad-shouldered from years of ranch work, with a temper that flared hot and burned long. 5 months apart hadn't softened his features or the hatred in his eyes. "Harold." She forced herself to stand her ground. "I told Mrs. Willoughby I'd meet you at the boarding house, and I told you we'd talk tonight." Harold stopped a few feet away, his gaze shifting to Frank. "This doesn't concern you, Turner." "Just having a friendly conversation," Frank replied evenly, though Josephine noticed how he'd subtly shifted his stance, placing himself slightly between her and Harold. Harold's lip curled. With my wife, find your own woman to talk to. I'm not your property, Harold, Josephine said, finding her voice stronger than she expected. The law says different. Harold took a step toward her. You're my wife, and you're coming home now. Frank's hand moved to rest casually near his holster. The lady doesn't seem ready to go with you, Abbott. Harold's face darkened. Stay out of this, Cowboy. Josephine and I have matters to settle. I've only come to sell my father's land, Josephine stated firmly. After that, I'll be returning to Dallas. Harold laughed, a harsh sound like breaking glass. Is that what you think? You ran off like a thief in the night, taking what was mine. You think you can just waltz back and sell my property? It was never yours, Josephine countered. My father left it to me, and you're my wife. Harold's voice dropped dangerously. What's yours is mine. Now come home before you embarrass yourself further. Around them, passers-by had begun to slow, sensing the drama unfolding. Josephine could feel their stares, their judgment. A proper wife didn't argue with her husband in the street. I'll be at the land office tomorrow morning, she said, trying to end the confrontation. After that, we need never see each other again. Harold's hand shot out, gripping her wrist with bruising force. You're coming home now. Before Josephine could react, Frank Turner had moved with surprising speed, his hand clamping down on Harold's forearm. Let her go, he said quietly, but with an edge that couldn't be mistaken. For a moment, the three of them stood frozen in a tableau of tension. Then Harold released her, shoving her arm away with disgust. You've always been trouble, he spat. Running to your father when things got difficult, now you're hiding behind strangers. Pathetic. I'm not hiding, Harold, I'm leaving, there's a difference. Harold's gaze swept over her contemptuously. Go back to Dallas then, but don't think you're taking that land. I've already spoken to Judge Wilson about my rights as your husband. With that, he turned and stalked back toward the saloon, shouldering roughly past a group of onlookers. Josephine stood shaking, aware of the whispers already circulating among the witnesses. This would be all over town by morning. Josephine Abbott, the shameless wife who'd run away, now publicly defying her husband. Are you all right, madam? Frank Turner's voice broke through her thoughts. She nodded stiffly. Thank you for your intervention, Mr. Turner, though I fear it's only made things worse. Frank glanced at the dispersing crowd. Seems to me things were already plenty bad. His eyes returned to her. I meant what I said about riding by Peterson's place. If you'd like to write a note, I can make sure he gets it tonight. Josephine considered the offer. With Harold aware of her intentions, she needed to act quickly. I would be grateful, she said finally. And perhaps you could recommend somewhere I might stay tonight. I don't think returning to Mrs. Willoughby's would be wise, Frank thought for a moment. My sister Rebecca runs a small farm about 2 miles west of town. She's often taken in women who needed a safe place. I'd be happy to escort you there. It was a risk trusting this stranger, but Josephine sensed genuine concern in his offer, and with Harold's temper inflamed by whiskey and wounded pride, she had little choice. That would be very kind, Mr. Turner, Frank nodded. Let me fetch my horse. We can stop by the general store for paper and ink on the way. As Frank disappeared into the livery stable, Josephine glanced around the street, half expecting to see Harold lurking nearby, but he seemed to have truly retreated to the saloon. The sun was setting in earnest now, the sky deepening to purple. Josephine pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. One day back in Chisum Ranch, and already her plans were unraveling. Yet somehow, in the midst of this new chaos, she'd found an unexpected ally. Frank returned leading 2 horses, a sturdy buckskin gelding and a dappled mare. Rebecca left her horse in town yesterday, he explained, handing Josephine the mare's reins. She'll be glad to have her back. I haven't ridden in some time, Josephine admitted, stroking the mare's velvety nose. Frank offered a reassuring smile. Daisy's gentle as they come, we'll take it slow. They rode out of town as darkness fell, the mare following Frank's gelding with practiced ease. Once they were beyond the town limits, Josephine felt something loosen in her chest, a tightness she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. Been a while since you left? Frank asked over his shoulder. 5 months, she replied, adjusting her seat as the mare navigated a dip in the road. I never intended to come back at all, but circumstances changed. Frank nodded but didn't press for details, a courtesy Josephine appreciated. "You're not from around here originally," she observed, noting his accent not quite Texan with hints of somewhere farther east. "Virginia, originally. Came west after the war." Frank adjusted his hat against the evening breeze. "Been in Texas about 8 years now. And your sister came with you." "Rebecca joined me 3 years ago after her husband died at Shiloh. She's made a good life here, all things considered." They continued in companionable silence for a while, the only sounds the steady rhythm of hoofbeats and the occasional call of a night bird. Stars emerged in the vast Texas sky, brighter than Josephine remembered from Dallas. "If you don't mind me asking," Frank said eventually, "what's so important about this land you've come back for?" Josephine considered her answer carefully. "It's the only thing that's truly mine. My father homesteaded it when I was just a girl. He built every inch of that cabin with his own hands." She paused, memories flooding back. "He taught me to read there, to write, to think for myself, things a woman isn't supposed to value too highly in these parts. Your father sounds like an unusual man." He was. He believed women deserved the same freedoms as men, the same education. Josephine smiled sadly in the darkness. It made finding a suitable husband rather difficult. Most men don't want a wife with too many opinions. And Harold Abbott, Harold seemed different at first. He spoke of building something together, of respecting what my father had created. Her voice hardened. "But once we were married, he only wanted to sell the land and use the money for gambling and drinking. When I refused, well, things became difficult." Frank was quiet for a moment. "Is that why you left?" Josephine's hand unconsciously rose to touch her cheek, remembering the bruises that had once bloomed there. "Among other reasons." Frank didn't respond immediately, but when he did, his voice was low and certain. "You left for the right reasons, Mrs. Abbott. No matter what anyone in that town says." His words, simple, direct, without judgment, nearly undid her. For months, she'd carried the weight of shame and doubt, wondering if she'd been wrong to flee, if she should have tried harder, endured more. To hear someone validate her choice, especially a stranger who had no reason to take her side, felt like the first clean breath after a long illness. "Thank you, Mr. Turner," she said softly. They crested a small hill and Frank pointed to a cluster of lights ahead. "That's Rebecca's place. Nothing fancy, but it's solid." As they approached, Josephine could make out a modest farmhouse with a wide porch, lamplight glowing from the windows. A barn stood nearby, and in the dim starlight, she could see fields of what looked like corn stretching behind the house. A woman appeared in the doorway as they rode into the yard, silhouetted against the warm light from inside. "Frank, is that you bringing my horse back?" she called. "It's me, Becca," Frank answered, dismounting and helping Josephine down from the mare. "And I've brought a guest who needs a place to stay tonight." Rebecca Turner stepped fully onto the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. She was tall like her brother, with the same storm-colored eyes, though her hair was several shades lighter, pulled back in a practical braid. "Always room for one more," she said warmly, extending a hand to Josephine. "Rebecca Turner." "Josephine Abbott," she replied, taking the offered hand. "I hope I'm not imposing." Recognition flickered in Rebecca's eyes at the name, but she masked it quickly with a smile. "Not at all. Any friend of Frank's is welcome here. Mrs. Abbott needs somewhere safe to stay tonight," Frank explained, leading the horses toward the barn. "I'll see to the animals and join you ladies in a minute." Rebecca ushered Josephine inside, where the scent of fresh bread and stew filled the small but tidy kitchen. "Sit, please. You must be hungry after your journey." Josephine sank gratefully into a chair at the wooden table. "I haven't eaten since breakfast." Rebecca busied herself with bowls and spoons. "Frank has a habit of bringing home strays in need of kindness," she said with a gentle smile. "Usually it's injured animals or down on their luck cowhands, but I'm pleased to have female company for a change." "Your brother mentioned you've helped women before," Josephine said carefully. Rebecca paused in her preparations. "He told you that, did he?" she sighed, placing a steaming bowl of stew in front of Josephine. "Yes, I've been known to offer sanctuary to those who need it. This world isn't kind to women alone, especially those trying to escape difficult situations." The implication was clear. Rebecca knew exactly what sort of situation Josephine was fleeing, Thank you, Josephine said simply, too tired for pretense. I don't intend to stay long. Just until I can sell my property and return to Dallas. Rebecca took a seat across from her. Sometimes plans change. Eat your stew before it gets cold. The food was simple but delicious tender beef, potatoes, and carrots in a rich broth. Josephine hadn't realized how hungry she was until the first spoonful touched her lips. Frank joined them shortly, washing up at the basin by the door before taking a seat at the table. Rebecca served him without comment, then sat with her own bowl. I've written to Mr. Peterson explaining your situation, Frank said to Josephine. I'll ride out to his place after supper and make sure he gets it tonight. I can't thank you enough, Josephine replied. Both of you. Rebecca waved away her thanks. What's your plan after you sell the property? Do you have family in Dallas? My aunt runs a boarding house there. I've been helping her manage it these past few months. Josephine stirred her stew thoughtfully. She's offered to make me a partner if I can contribute some capital. Sounds like a good opportunity, Frank commented. It is, a chance to be truly independent. Josephine smiled wryly. Though I'm finding independence comes at a higher price for women than for men. Rebecca nodded in understanding that it does. But the price of staying in a bad situation is often higher still. After supper, Frank prepared to ride out to the land agent's home. Josephine followed him onto the porch, anxiety building again at the thought of Harold discovering her whereabouts. What if Harold follows you? She asked. Frank checked his saddle cinch. He won't. He'll be deep in his cups by now, and tomorrow he'll be nursing a sore head. He mounted his gelding with easy grace. Besides, even if he does figure out where you are, Rebecca keeps a shotgun and knows how to use it. This was oddly reassuring. I'll repay you for this kindness somehow. Frank shook his head. Not necessary. Some things are just right to do. He settled his hat more firmly. Get some rest, Mrs. Abbott. Tomorrow will be a new day. Josephine watched him ride into the darkness, a strange sense of security settling over her despite the uncertainty of her situation. Inside, Rebecca was clearing the table. Frank's a good man, Rebecca said as Josephine rejoined her. The war changed him, made him more aware of injustice, I think. He can't stand to see the vulnerable mistreated. He mentioned Virginia, Josephine said, picking up a dish towel to help dry. Rebecca nodded. Our family owned a small farm near Richmond. When the war came, Frank joined the Union Army, much to our father's dismay. He believed in the cause, believed slavery was an abomination. That couldn't have been easy in Virginia. It wasn't. He wasn't welcome home afterward. Rebecca handed Josephine a clean plate. He went west, worked cattle drives, eventually saved enough for a small ranch north of here. When my husband died, Frank brought me out too, said Texas was a place where people could reinvent themselves. Is that true, do you think? Josephine asked, carefully drying a blue-patterned plate. Rebecca considered this. For some, for others, the past has a way of following. She glanced at Josephine, but it doesn't have to define your future. Remember that. Later, settled in the small but comfortable guest room, Josephine lay awake listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the countryside, so different from Dallas, and different still from the house she had shared with Harold. Out here, there was a vastness, a sense of possibility that had been absent from her life for too long. She thought of Frank Turner's words, "You left for the right reasons." Such a simple statement, yet it had lifted some of the burden she'd carried since fleeing her marriage. Perhaps there was truth in what Rebecca had said. The past didn't have to define her future. With that thought, she finally drifted into the deepest sleep she'd known in months. Morning came with the crowing of a rooster and the scent of coffee drifting under her door. Josephine dressed quickly in her spare dress, a practical gray calico that had seen better days but was clean and presentable. In the kitchen, she found Rebecca kneading dough, flour dusting her forearms. "Good morning," Rebecca greeted her. "Coffee's hot if you'd like some." Frank rode out early, said to tell you Mr. Peterson will meet you at the land office at 9 o'clock. Relief washed over Josephine. That's wonderful news. Frank will escort you into town. Rebecca punched down her dough with practiced hands. I've packed some biscuits and jerky for your journey back to Dallas, whenever that may be. You're very kind, especially to a stranger with complicated circumstances. Rebecca looked up, her expression serious. I know what it's like to want a fresh start. And I know what people in small towns say about women who don't conform to their expectations. She returned to her kneading. Their opinions matter far less than they think. Josephine smiled, warmed by this show of solidarity. She poured herself coffee and sat at the table, watching Rebecca work with practiced efficiency. May I ask you something personal? Josephine ventured after a few moments. You may ask, I may not answer, Rebecca replied with a hint of humor. Have you ever considered remarrying? After your husband, I mean. Rebecca's hand stilled briefly. Once or twice, there have been offers. She resumed her kneading. But I've found I prefer making my own decisions, running my own household. Marriage means giving up certain freedoms, as you well know. It doesn't have to, Josephine said softly. Not with the right person. Rebecca smiled sadly. Perhaps, but such men are rare indeed. The sound of hoofbeats interrupted their conversation. Frank appeared in the doorway moments later, removing his hat as he entered. Peterson's eager to meet with you, he announced. Seems he's had a standing offer on your father's property for some time but couldn't proceed without the deed holder's consent. Josephine's heart quickened. An offer from whom? He didn't say, but mentioned it was a fair price above market value, in fact. This was better than Josephine had dared hope. A quick sale at a good price would mean she could leave Chisum Ranch by tomorrow, perhaps even today if the paperwork could be expedited. We should go soon, Frank continued, accepting a cup of coffee from his sister. Peterson said he'd wait at the office until noon, but best not to delay. Rebecca wrapped several biscuits in a cloth. Take these. No sense facing important business on an empty stomach. Within half an hour, Josephine and Frank were riding toward town, the morning sun warm on their backs. Chisum Ranch looked different in the clear light of day, less threatening somehow, though Josephine still felt a flutter of anxiety as they approached the outskirts. I'll understand if you'd prefer not to be seen with me, she said as they neared the main street. My reputation in town isn't exactly stellar at the moment. Frank gave her a sidelong glance. Mrs. Abbott, I've never much cared what people in this town think of me. I don't intend to start now. His steadfastness was both reassuring and puzzling. Why are you helping me? You hardly know me. Frank was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. 2 years ago, my sister-in-law, my brother's wife back in Virginia, tried to leave him. He was a mean drunk, worse than your Harold from what I understand. His jaw tightened. No one helped her. No one stood up for her right to leave a man who beat her. She died that winter, pneumonia they said, but I think it was a broken spirit that killed her. Josephine felt her throat tighten with emotion. I'm so sorry, so am I. Frank's expression softened as he looked at her. When I saw you yesterday, standing up to Harold despite everything, I thought perhaps I could do for you what no one did for Elizabeth. There was no pity in his gaze, only respect and a certain kinship of understanding that touched Josephine deeply. Thank you, she said simply. They rode the rest of the way in comfortable silence. The land office was already open when they arrived, Mr. Peterson visible through the window, arranging papers on his desk. Would you like me to come in with you? Frank asked as he helped her dismount. Josephine considered the offer. I think this is something I need to do myself. But thank you, Frank nodded. I'll wait out here, keep an eye out for trouble. Inside the land office, Mr. Peterson, a thin, bespectacled man with ink-stained fingers, greeted her with formal politeness. Mrs. Abbott, good morning. Mr. Turner delivered your message. I understand you wish to sell your father's homestead. That's correct, Josephine confirmed, retrieving the deed from her pocket. I believe you mentioned there's already been interest in the property. Peterson nodded, examining the deed carefully. Yes, indeed. The Barton Creek Mining Company has expressed interest in several properties along the creek, including yours. They're offering $12 an acre, a very generous sum. Josephine's breath caught. $12 an acre for 10 acres, far more than she had hoped for. With $120, she could buy into her aunt's business and still have money left over to improve the boarding house. Why would they pay so much? She asked cautiously. The land isn't particularly fertile. Peterson leaned forward, lowering his voice conspiratorially. Between us, they've found copper deposits in that area. Not a full mine's worth, but enough to make it worthwhile. Most folks don't know the value of what they're sitting on. Her father had always said that land was the one thing nobody could make more of. How right he had been. "How soon can the sale be completed?" she asked. "I can draw up the papers today. Their representative is due in town tomorrow to finalize several purchases. You could have your money by noon tomorrow." It was perfect, almost too perfect. Josephine felt a flicker of suspicion. "Does my husband know about this offer?" Peterson shifted uncomfortably. "Mr. Abbott has inquired about the property several times. He claimed to be acting on your behalf, but without the deed or your written consent, my hands were tied." So that was why Harold had been so angry to see her at the land office. He'd been trying to sell her property himself, likely planning to pocket the money before she ever knew about the copper. "I'll sell," she decided firmly, "but I want everything legal and binding." "No possibility of my husband interfering." Peterson nodded. "I'll make sure everything is in order. As you're selling property you owned prior to your marriage, and as it was specifically left to you in your father's will, Mr. Abbott has no legal claim without your consent." Relief washed over her. "Thank you, Mr. Peterson." As the land agent began preparing the necessary documents, Josephine glanced out the window to where Frank waited, leaning against a hitching post, his posture relaxed but his eyes alert. Something warm unfurled in her chest at the sight of him, a feeling she hadn't experienced in a very long time. The bell above the door jangled, drawing her attention. Sheriff Mills stepped inside, his expression grave. "Mrs. Abbott," he nodded to her, then to Peterson. "Got a moment, John?" The two men stepped into a corner, speaking in hushed tones. Josephine couldn't hear their words, but the sheriff's serious demeanor sent a chill down her spine. When they finished their conversation, Peterson looked troubled. "Is something wrong?" Josephine asked as the sheriff departed with a tip of his hat. Peterson sighed heavily. "I'm afraid there's been an incident. Your husband was involved in an altercation at the saloon last night. It seems he took exception to some comments made about your situation." Josephine's stomach tightened. "Is he hurt?" "No, madam, but he hurt someone else quite badly. Billy Rollins is at the doctor's now with a broken jaw and 3 cracked ribs." Peterson lowered his voice. "Sheriff's looking for Harold now. Seems he disappeared after the fight." This complicated matters. If Harold was in trouble with the law, he'd be even more desperate to get his hands on the money from her land. "Should we continue with the paperwork?" she asked. Peterson straightened his spectacles. "Absolutely. In fact, I'd recommend we complete as much as possible today. The sooner your property is legally transferred, the better." Josephine spent the next 2 hours going over documents, signing her name again and again until her hand cramped. When she finally emerged from the land office, Frank pushed away from the hitching post, concern evident in his features. "Everything all right?" The sheriff seemed troubled when he left. Josephine explained the situation as they walked toward their horses. Frank's expression darkened at the news of Harold's violence and subsequent disappearance. "This changes things," he said grimly. "If Harold's on the run from the sheriff, he's got nothing left to lose. The sale will be complete tomorrow," Josephine said. "Once I have the money, I can leave immediately." Frank shook his head. "He knows you're here to sell the land. He'll be looking for you, especially now that he needs money to flee." Josephine hadn't considered this angle. "What should I do?" Frank thought for a moment. "Come back to Rebecca's tonight. It's safe there and Harold doesn't know where it is. Tomorrow I'll bring you back to town to complete the sale, then escort you to the stage depot myself." It was a sensible plan, but Josephine hesitated. "I've imposed on your kindness too much already." "It's not an imposition," Frank said firmly. "Besides, Rebecca enjoys having another woman around. She told me so this morning." Before Josephine could respond, a shrill voice called her name. Edith Parker was hurrying toward them from the direction of the mercantile, her face alight with malicious excitement. "Josephine Abbott, the nerve of you showing your face in town again after what your husband did last night." Josephine stiffened but kept her voice level. "Good morning, Mrs. Parker." Edith's gaze darted between Josephine and Frank, her eyes narrowing. "I see you've wasted no time finding new company. No wonder Harold was so upset." "Mrs. Parker," Frank interrupted coolly, "I believe the general store is running a special on minding one's own business today." Might be worth looking into. Edith's mouth fell open in indignation. Well, that's precisely the problem, Frank continued pleasantly. You never do stop gossiping long enough to learn the truth of matters. Color flooded Edith's cheeks. The whole town knows the truth about Josephine Abbott. Running off, abandoning her husband, now carrying on with "that's quite enough." Josephine cut in, her voice sharper than she'd intended. What I do or don't do is no concern of yours, Mrs. Parker. Now if you'll excuse us, we have business to attend to. Without waiting for a response, Josephine turned and continued toward their horses, Frank falling into step beside her. She could feel Edith's outraged stare burning into her back. That'll be all over town in an hour, Frank commented once they were out of earshot. Let it, Josephine replied with more conviction than she felt. I'll be gone soon enough. They mounted their horses and rode out of town without further incident, though Josephine was acutely aware of the stares and whispers that followed them. The weight of public judgment hung heavy in the air. As they reached open country, Frank broke the silence. You handled Mrs. Parker admirably. Josephine managed a small smile. 5 months ago, I would have withered under her gaze. It's strange how quickly we can change when we must. Not everyone does, Frank observed. Some folks break instead of bending. I nearly did, she admitted. When I first reached Dallas, I was not well. My aunt thought I might waste away entirely. What changed? Josephine considered the question. I started helping at the boarding house. Taking care of others somehow helped me take care of myself, and I began to realize that I wasn't the shameful creature Harold had convinced me I was. Frank nodded thoughtfully. Shame's a powerful weapon. Those who wield it rarely deserve the power it gives them. They rode in companionable silence for a while, the afternoon sun warm against their backs. Josephine found herself studying Frank's profile against the backdrop of the rolling Texas landscape. There was a quiet strength about him, different from Harold's aggressive bluster or the patronizing confidence of most men she'd known. You're not what I expected from a Texas rancher, she observed. Frank chuckled. No, what did you expect? More swagger, less philosophy, she replied with a smile. Fewer opinions about the nature of shame. Disappointed, he asked, a hint of humor in his eyes. Not in the slightest. Their gazes held for a moment longer than was strictly proper, and Josephine felt a flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with anxiety. She looked away first, unsettled by her reaction to this near stranger. Rebecca was in the vegetable garden when they arrived, a wide-brimmed straw hat protecting her face from the sun. She straightened at their approach, brushing soil from her hands. How did it go? She called. Josephine dismounted, accepting Frank's offered hand with a murmured thanks. Better than expected. The sale should be complete tomorrow. Inside, over glasses of cool water, Josephine explained the details: the mining company's interest, Harold's trouble with the law, the plan for tomorrow. Rebecca listened thoughtfully. You're welcome to stay here as long as needed, of course, but I must admit, I'm concerned about Harold. Men like that don't simply give up what they believe is theirs. Rebecca's right, Frank agreed. Even after you've sold the land and left town, he might come looking for you in Dallas. Josephine had considered this possibility during sleepless nights in her aunt's house. My aunt's boarding house is in a busy area. There are always people around. Safety in numbers, Rebecca asked skeptically. It's the best I can do for now. Josephine traced the rim of her glass with one finger. Perhaps eventually I'll move further away, San Francisco maybe, or even back east. Frank's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. Running forever isn't much of a life either. What would you suggest? Josephine asked, a hint of challenge in her voice. Divorce is nearly impossible for a woman to obtain, especially on grounds of cruelty. Even if I could, the stigma would follow me everywhere. There are other options, Frank said carefully. Other ways to secure your independence. Before he could elaborate, the sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted their conversation. Frank moved to the window, his hand instinctively moving to the revolver at his hip. It's Sheriff Mills, he announced, relaxing slightly. Alone. Rebecca went to the door as the sheriff dismounted in the yard. Sheriff, she greeted him. What brings you out this way? Afternoon, Miss Turner. Mills removed his hat. I'm looking for Mrs. Abbott. Heard she might be staying with you. Josephine joined Rebecca at the door, apprehension coiling in her stomach. "I'm here, Sheriff. Is something wrong?" Sheriff Mills's weathered face was grim. "I'm afraid I have news, madam. Your husband was found an hour ago at your father's old property. He's dead." The words seemed to hang in the air, impossible to comprehend. "Dead," Josephine repeated numbly. "How? Looks like he was searching the cabin, maybe for the deed. The old place isn't stable, part of the roof collapsed on him. Doctor says his neck was broken instantly." Josephine felt the blood drain from her face. She'd hated Harold, feared him, but never wished him dead. The shock of it left her hollow. "I'm sorry to bring such news," Mills continued awkwardly. "I know things weren't good between you, but still, he was your husband." Frank appeared beside her, his steady presence anchoring her in the sudden chaos of emotion. "Thank you for coming in person, Sheriff," Mills nodded. "There'll need to be arrangements made, of course, and there's the matter of the assault charges against him, though I suppose that's moot now." "I'll see to the arrangements," Josephine said mechanically, her mind struggling to process the implications. Is there anything else needed from me today?" "No, madam. Tomorrow will be soon enough to deal with the details." The sheriff replaced his hat. "Again, my condolences." After he departed, Josephine stood motionless in the doorway, staring at the empty yard. Frank gently guided her back inside to a chair. "Drink this," Rebecca urged, pressing a glass into her hands. Not water this time, whiskey, by the burn as it went down her throat. "I never wished him harm," Josephine said finally, "despite everything." "Of course you didn't," Rebecca assured her. "It was an accident, pure and simple," Frank added. "Old buildings can be treacherous." Josephine looked up at him, suddenly understanding the full implications. "I'm a widow." The word fell from her lips like a revelation. Widowhood carried none of the shame of abandonment or divorce. A widow was an object of sympathy, not scorn. And legally, she was free to own property, to make contracts, to live independently without fear of a husband's claims. "Yes," Frank confirmed quietly. "You're a widow." The reality settled over her gradually as the afternoon waned into evening. Harold was gone. The man who had dominated her thoughts for years, first with false promises, then with fear, had vanished from the world in an instant. She felt no joy, but neither did she feel the grief expected of a loving wife. Instead, there was a complex mixture of relief, guilt, and a strange, disorienting sense of possibility. Rebecca prepared a simple dinner, which Josephine barely touched. Frank made plans to ride into town the next day to speak with the undertaker and confirm that the sale of the property could still proceed despite the changed circumstances. "You might want to delay your return to Dallas," he suggested gently. "Leaving immediately after your husband's death would raise eyebrows." "More gossip," Josephine sighed. "Will it never end?" "Give it a week or two," Rebecca advised. "Stay here if you like. Once Harold is buried and the property matter settled, you can decide your next steps with a clearer head." Josephine accepted their counsel, too emotionally exhausted to argue. That night, lying awake in the small guest room, she found herself contemplating a future suddenly wider than she had imagined just days ago. The money from the land sale was still coming more than enough to secure her position with her aunt, or perhaps to start something entirely new. And then there was Frank Turner, with his quiet strength and unexpected kindness. She found her thoughts returning to him repeatedly, wondering at the strange connection that had formed between them in such a short time. Morning brought a clearer perspective. Harold's death was tragic, yes, but it also represented an opportunity, a chance to truly begin again without constantly looking over her shoulder. She resolved to face the coming days with dignity and pragmatism. Frank had already left for town when she came down for breakfast. Rebecca explained he'd gone to make arrangements with the undertaker and to check on the status of the land sale. "He's taken quite an interest in your situation," Rebecca observed, setting a plate of eggs and bacon before Josephine. "He's been very kind," Josephine agreed carefully. Rebecca studied her for a moment. "My brother doesn't extend himself for just anyone, you know. He sees something in you." Josephine felt heat rise to her cheeks. "We've only just met. Sometimes that's all it takes." Rebecca sat down with her own plate. After the war, Frank was different. Harder, he did what needed doing, but there was a light gone out of him. She buttered a piece of bread thoughtfully. These past 2 days, I've seen glimpses of the brother I remember from before. Josephine didn't know how to respond to this revelation. I'm leaving soon, she said finally. Back to Dallas once everything is settled here. Are you? Rebecca asked mildly. Strange, I had the impression you weren't entirely certain about that anymore. Before Josephine could formulate a reply, the sound of an approaching wagon drew their attention. Frank had returned, accompanied by a somber-faced man Josephine recognized as Mr. Hargrove, the town undertaker. The next few hours passed in a blur of practical discussions, burial arrangements, announcements, costs. Josephine moved through it all with a detached efficiency that surprised even herself. Harold would be buried the following afternoon in the town cemetery with a simple service led by the local preacher. I've also spoken with Peterson, Frank informed her once Hargrove had departed. The mining company representative is still coming tomorrow. He sees no reason why the sale can't proceed as planned, especially given your status as widow. That's good, Josephine said, the word feeling inadequate for the complex emotions swirling within her. There's something else, Frank continued, a hesitancy in his voice she hadn't heard before. Peterson mentioned that the company is looking to establish a local office. They'll need someone who knows the area, understands land transactions. Josephine looked at him quizzically. And he suggested I might be suited for the position. Frank ran a hand through his hair, a rare gesture of uncertainty. It would mean selling my ranch, but the salary would be substantial, stable too, not subject to drought or cattle prices. That sounds like a wonderful opportunity, Josephine said sincerely. Will you take it? Frank's eyes met hers. I'm considering it. It would mean staying in Chisum Ranch, though. The implication hung in the air between them, unspoken but unmistakable. If she returned to Dallas and he remained here, whatever connection had begun to form between them would likely wither before it had a chance to truly grow. I see, she said softly. Rebecca, who had been quietly observing their exchange, stood abruptly. I just remembered I need to check on the chickens. Excuse me. Alone with Frank, Josephine felt suddenly nervous, aware of him in a way that both thrilled and frightened her. Mrs. Abbott, Josephine, he began, then stopped, seeming to gather his thoughts. I know this is terribly inappropriate timing with your husband not yet buried, and we've known each other only days, but I find myself, he paused again. I find myself reluctant to see you leave. Josephine's heart quickened. Mr. Turner, Frank, please, Frank. His name felt right on her lips. I don't know what to say. Everything is happening so quickly. I understand. He took a step back, giving her space. I'm not asking for anything. I just wanted you to know that there might be reasons to consider staying in Chisum Ranch. Not immediately, perhaps, but eventually. Josephine thought of Dallas, of her aunt's boarding house. It had been a refuge, a safe harbor when she'd needed one desperately, but it had never felt like home. I need time, she said finally. Time to think, to sort through everything that's happened. Frank nodded. Of course, take all the time you need. The day of Harold's funeral dawned clear and hot, typical Texas weather that made black mourning clothes particularly oppressive. Josephine wore her darkest dress navy blue rather than true black, and a veiled hat borrowed from Rebecca. The service was brief and sparsely attended. A few of Harold's drinking companions from the saloon, Sheriff Mills out of respect for his office, Mr. Peterson representing business interests, and a scattering of townspeople drawn more by curiosity than genuine grief. Josephine stood at the graveside with appropriate solemnity, Frank and Rebecca flanking her like protective sentinels. Edith Parker and her circle kept their distance, though their whispers carried on the still air. Josephine caught fragments, convenient timing, and awfully friendly with that Turner fellow, but found they stung less than expected. The opinions of Chisum Ranch mattered less with each passing hour. After the final prayer, people began to disperse. Several approached Josephine with awkward condolences, most avoiding her eyes. She accepted each with quiet dignity, neither encouraging nor discouraging conversation. As the last mourners departed, Frank touched her elbow gently. Peterson is waiting at his office. The mining company representative arrived this morning. Josephine nodded, taking a last look at the fresh, turned earth covering Harold's pine coffin. 5 years of marriage ended in a mound of dirt and a simple wooden marker. She felt a complex swirl of emotions: regret for what might have been, relief that it was truly over, and a strange sense of gratitude for the freedom his death had granted her. "Goodbye, Harold," she murmured, then turned away from the grave, ready to face what came next. The meeting at the land office was brisk and businesslike. The mining company representative, a Mr. Donovan from St. Louis, reviewed the paperwork, asked a few questions about the property boundaries, then counted out $12 for each acre in crisp new bills. $120 more money than Josephine had ever possessed at one time. "A pleasure doing business with you, Mrs. Abbott," Donovan said, shaking her hand with professional courtesy. "If you should happen to acquire other properties in the area, our company would be most interested." "I'll keep that in mind," Josephine replied, though she had no intention of owning land in Chisum Ranch again. As they left the land office, Frank cleared his throat. "Donovan offered me the position. I start next month." Josephine looked up at him in surprise. "You accepted just like that?" "Sometimes you know when something's right," he said simply. "When the opportunity matches what you need." They walked in silence toward the hotel, where Josephine had taken a room for her remaining days in town. The stage to Dallas would leave in 3 days, and she had reserved a seat. "Frank," she said finally, stopping in the shadow of the hotel porch, "I'm still planning to return to Dallas." He nodded, disappointment evident in his eyes despite his attempt to hide it. "I understand you have a life there." "Yes, but—" she hesitated, gathering courage. "I find myself wondering if it's the life I truly want." Hope flickered across his features. "What do you want, Josephine?" It was a simple question, but one she'd rarely been asked, and never with such genuine interest in her answer. "I want to be somewhere I'm not defined by my past," she said slowly. "Somewhere I can build something of my own, and—" she met his gaze directly. "I want to know you better, Frank Turner." A smile spread across his face, transforming his features. "I'd like that very much." "I need to return to Dallas," she continued, "to settle my affairs, to explain to my aunt, but perhaps after that. I'll be here," he said softly, "however long it takes." Josephine felt something warm unfurl in her chest, not the desperate longing she'd once mistaken for love with Harold, but something steadier, more grounded. A beginning rather than an ending. 2 weeks, she decided. "I'll return to Dallas for 2 weeks, then come back to Chisum Ranch." Frank's smile deepened. "I'll meet every stage until I see you again." In that moment, standing in the afternoon sunshine of a town that had once judged her so harshly, Josephine felt the last chains of her past begin to fall away. Ahead lay uncertainty, yes, but also possibility, choice, and perhaps even love. "In the meantime," Frank said, offering his arm, "may I escort you to dinner? Rebecca's expecting us, and she makes a peach cobbler that's worth riding 10 miles for." Josephine took his arm, her smile matching his. "I'd be delighted." As they walked toward their horses, heads bent in easy conversation, neither noticed Edith Parker watching from the mercantile window, nor did they hear her scandalized whispers about the impropriety of a new widow smiling so soon after her husband's burial. Had they heard, they might not have cared. The opinions of others had governed Josephine's life for too long. Now she was writing her own story, one choice at a time. The 2 weeks in Dallas passed more quickly than Josephine had anticipated. Her aunt, a practical woman who had never approved of Harold, received the news of his death with a raised eyebrow and a murmured, "The Lord works in mysterious ways." When Josephine explained her intention to return to Chisum Ranch, however, Aunt Margaret was less sanguine. "After everything that happened there, and for a man you barely know, it's not just about Frank," Josephine insisted, though he featured prominently in her thoughts. "It's about making a choice for myself, not running from something or someone." In the end, Aunt Margaret grudgingly accepted her decision, extracting a promise that Josephine would write regularly and return for visits. The boarding house would remain a safe harbor if needed. The journey back to Chisum Ranch felt different from her previous trips, filled with anticipation rather than dread. As the stagecoach rattled into town, Josephine peered eagerly through the window, searching for a familiar figure. Frank was waiting, just as he'd promised, his tall form easily distinguishable among the small crowd at the stage depot. When their eyes met through the dusty window, the smile that spread across his face confirmed what her heart already knew: she had made the right choice. He helped her down from the stage, his hands strong and sure around her waist. For a moment they stood close, oblivious to curious onlookers. "Welcome back," he said softly. "It's good to be back," she replied, meaning it with a depth that surprised her. Rebecca had prepared the guest room again, but this time it felt different, not a temporary shelter, but the beginning of something permanent. Over dinner that evening, the three of them discussed practical matters: where Josephine would live, what work she might find, how to navigate the inevitable gossip. "The mining company's setting up an office in town," Frank explained. "They'll need someone to manage correspondence, keep the books." "I mentioned your experience helping your aunt with the boarding house." Josephine looked at him in surprise. "You think they'd hire me?" "Donovan was impressed when I described your aptitude with figures. He's willing to meet with you tomorrow." The position was perfect, respectable work that utilized her skills, with a salary that would allow her true independence. She could rent rooms in town, establish herself as a widow of means rather than an object of pity or scorn. But gossip would still follow, especially given her growing relationship with Frank. Some would claim she'd had designs on him even before Harold's death. Others would judge her for not observing a longer period of mourning. "People will talk," Rebecca acknowledged when Josephine voiced these concerns. "They always do, but eventually they'll find something more interesting to discuss." "And in the meantime?" Josephine asked. Frank reached across the table, taking her hand in his. "In the meantime, we live our lives on our terms, not theirs." Coming from anyone else, it might have seemed naively optimistic, but Frank had already demonstrated his indifference to town opinion by publicly supporting her when she was at her most vulnerable. If he could weather that storm, perhaps they could weather this one too. The meeting with Donovan the next day exceeded Josephine's expectations. The mining executive was impressed with her knowledge of bookkeeping and her articulate manner. By the end of their conversation, he'd offered her the position of office manager at a salary that made her eyes widen. "We value competence, Mrs. Abbott," he explained, noting her surprise. "Gender is irrelevant when it comes to maintaining accurate records and managing correspondence." With employment secured, Josephine found suitable accommodations: a small but well-kept set of rooms above the dressmaker's shop, conveniently located near both the new mining office and Frank's modest house on the edge of town. Over the following weeks, she established a routine. Mornings were devoted to setting up the company's office systems, afternoons to meetings with Frank and other company representatives about land acquisitions. Evenings often found her at Frank's table or at Rebecca's farm, sharing meals and conversation that grew increasingly comfortable and intimate. Gradually, the whispers around town began to change. Josephine's efficiency and professionalism impressed even skeptical businessmen. Her widow's status, combined with her evident capability, earned a measure of respect that had been impossible during her marriage. And those who had been quick to judge her for leaving Harold were silenced by reports from the doctor, who had examined his body and found evidence of a heavy drinker whose liver had been near failure. "He wouldn't have lived much longer anyway, Doctor." Wilson confided to his wife, who naturally shared this information with her sewing circle. That roof just hastened the inevitable. 3 months after her return to Chisum Ranch, Josephine sat on Frank's porch swing, watching the sunset paint the western sky in brilliant hues. Frank emerged from the house with 2 glasses of lemonade, settling beside her with comfortable familiarity. "Penny for your thoughts," he said, handing her a glass. Josephine smiled. "I was just thinking about how much has changed since I first stepped off that stagecoach." "For the better, I hope," unquestionably. She took a sip of lemonade. "I came back here seeking closure, but instead I found a beginning." Frank's hand found hers, their fingers intertwining with practiced ease. Over the past months, their relationship had deepened from tentative friendship to something much more profound. They'd shared stories, dreams, fears, building a foundation of trust that Josephine had never experienced in her previous relationship. Josephine, Frank said, his voice taking on a serious tone, I've been thinking. She turned to face him, noting the unusual nervousness in his expression. About us, about the future. He set his glass aside, taking both her hands in his. I know it's only been a few months, and perhaps this is too soon. If so, I'll wait. But I need you to know that I love you, and I would be honored if you would consider becoming my wife. Though she had begun to hope for this moment, the reality of it still took her breath away. Frank. Before you answer, he continued earnestly, I want you to understand something. I'm not asking you to surrender your independence. The work you do, the life you've built, those are yours. Marriage shouldn't mean giving those up. His understanding of what mattered most to her, the freedom she'd fought so hard to win, moved her deeply. I love you too, she said simply. And yes, I will marry you. The joy that illuminated his face was answer enough to any lingering doubts. This was nothing like her decision to marry Harold, made from a combination of social pressure and naive hope. This choice came from knowing herself and knowing Frank, his strengths, his flaws, his unwavering respect for her as an equal. I have conditions, she added, a smile playing at her lips. Frank raised an eyebrow. I'm listening. I want to keep working, at least until we decide to have children. If we do, he nodded. Of course. And I want a proper wedding, not a hurried ceremony to silence gossip. Something small but meaningful with Rebecca and your friends and my aunt from Dallas. Anything else? He asked, his eyes warm with amusement and love. Josephine pretended to consider. Yes, I want this porch swing at our house. I've grown quite fond of it. Frank laughed, pulling her close. The swing comes with us, I promise. As they sealed their engagement with a kiss, Josephine felt a sense of rightness, of coming home in a way that transcended physical location. In Frank's arms, she had found what she'd always sought, not just love, but partnership, respect, understanding. They were married that autumn, when the Texas heat had given way to more merciful temperatures. The ceremony took place at Rebecca's farm, with wildflowers decorating the porch and a small gathering of genuine well-wishers in attendance. Aunt Margaret came from Dallas, bringing a handmade quilt as a wedding gift. Even Sheriff Mills attended, his presence a tacit stamp of community approval. Notably absent were the gossips who had once made Josephine's life so difficult. Edith Parker and her circle had not been invited, a decision neither bride nor groom regretted. As Josephine spoke her vows, dressed in a simple gown of ivory silk, she thought of how far she had come from that frightened woman who had fled in the night. The journey had been harder than she could have imagined, filled with judgment and pain, but also with unexpected kindness and, ultimately, love. I now pronounce you husband and wife, the preacher declared, and Frank kissed her with a tenderness that promised a lifetime of respect and partnership. At the small reception afterward, Rebecca raised a toast. To my brother and his bride, may you build a life together as strong and true as you both are. Later, as the celebration continued around them, Frank drew Josephine aside to the quiet end of the porch. Happy? He asked, his arms encircling her waist. More than I ever thought possible, she answered truthfully over his shoulder. She could see the last rays of sunlight gilding the landscape of Chisum Ranch, the town that had once shamed her, now the place where she had found redemption and love. The irony wasn't lost on her. What are you thinking? Frank murmured against her hair. Josephine smiled, leaning into his embrace. I'm thinking that sometimes the hardest journeys lead us exactly where we're meant to be. As twilight deepened into night, stars appearing one by one in the vast Texas sky, Josephine and Frank Turner began their life together not as husband and property, but as equal partners in a love story of their own writing. In the years that followed, Chisum Ranch grew and prospered, due in no small part to the copper mines that brought new business and residents to the area. Frank rose through the ranks of the mining company, eventually becoming regional manager. Josephine continued working until the birth of their first child, a son they named James after her father. 2 more children followed, a daughter, Elizabeth, named for Frank's sister-in-law who had never found her way to freedom, and another son, Thomas. Their home, built on land adjacent to Rebecca's farm, became known for its hospitality and warmth. Occasionally, when newcomers to town heard the story of how Josephine had once fled her first husband, There would be raised eyebrows or whispered judgments. But these were quickly silenced by those who had witnessed the true story, how she had returned with courage and dignity, how Frank had stood by her when others turned away, and how together they had built a life that honored both their pasts and their shared future. On their 20th anniversary, as they sat together on that same porch swing he had promised to bring to their home, Josephine reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked. "Standing up for me when the whole town was against me." It couldn't have been easy. Frank's arm tightened around her shoulders. "Not for a single moment. You left for the right reasons, Josephine, and I found you for the best ones." In the gentle Texas evening, surrounded by the life they had built together, Josephine knew with absolute certainty that he was right.